The vial burns in my pocket. Stolen medicine, my wife's last chance. The security guard's radio crackles behind me, his boots pounding the stairwell. Sarah's file is in Hayes's hands right now, the truth about to unravel. One wrong move, and I lose everything. The parking garage looms ahead, but the real trap is already closing. I clutch the falsified records, my fingers shaking. Jason's silence won't last. The guard's voice cuts through the dark. He's seen my face. And Sarah? She's sitting with the one man who can destroy us both. The clock's ticking. The lie's about to collapse. The fluorescent hum of the pharmacy storage room vibrated against David Miller's teeth. A low-frequency drone that seemed to sync with the frantic rhythm of his heart. He slid the glass vial into his breast pocket, the cold cylinder pressing through the thin cotton of his scrubs like an icicle. It weighed nothing, yet his shoulders slumped under the phantom gravity of the theft. This was the immunotherapy, the clear, liquid hope that the insurance companies had deemed too expensive for a woman with Sarah's statistical outlook. He pivoted to the workstation, his fingers hovering over the grease-stained keyboard. The screen cast a sterile blue pallor over his knuckles, making his skin look as translucent as his wife's. Delete, adjust, reconcile. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic, accusing heartbeat. David tapped the keys, the mechanical clicks echoing too loudly against the tile walls. He swapped the digits. 8 became 0. A surplus vanished into the digital ether. His breath hitched, catching on the medicinal scent of rubbing alcohol and floor wax that permeated the air. He wasn't just moving numbers. He was erasing the trail of his own desperation. If the hospital's inventory matched the logs, the missing vial didn't exist. In the eyes of the law, he was a ghost. In his own eyes, he was finally becoming the provider Sarah needed. The task required a surgical focus, but his mind kept drifting to the grocery list tucked in his wallet, the one he rewrote every Sunday. It was a habit born of a different tragedy, a reminder of the daughter he couldn't save because he had followed the rules. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He finished the entry, the screen flickering as the data saved. And for a moment, the silence of the pharmacy felt like a heavy shroud. "Miller, you still on shift?" David flinched, his hand snapping to the mouse. Nurse Holloway stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the harsh corridor light. She leaned against the frame, the rhythmic jingle of her keys cutting through the silence like a serrated blade. David didn't turn. He couldn't risk her seeing the tremor in his jaw. "Finishing the inventory logs," David said, his voice grating like gravel. He focused on the flickering monitor, watching the falsified data save. He felt the weight of the vial against his ribs, a secret promise. "You work too hard, Dave. Go home. Your wife is waiting." "Almost done," he muttered. He shut down the terminal, and the sudden darkness in the room felt heavier than the light. He walked past Holloway, nodding once, his pulse thrumming in his ears. The sliding doors hissed open, venting the hospital's recycled air into the humid Virginia night. But he couldn't leave just yet. There was a loose end, a witness to his shadow work. He made his way toward the pathology lab, the soles of his shoes squeaking against the polished linoleum. The air here was colder, smelling of formaldehyde and the sharp, vinegary sting of preservatives. He found Jason Reed hunched over a microscope, the young lab tech's shoulders tense. "Jason," David said, his voice dropping into a low, clinical tone. The younger man jumped, nearly knocking over a rack of test tubes. Jason's face was a map of anxiety. He'd seen David at the pharmacy terminal earlier, and they both knew he wasn't authorized to be there. David stepped closer, invading Jason's personal space, the smell of David's own sweat mixing with the lab's chemical stench. "I saw the logs, Dr. Miller," Jason whispered, his eyes darting toward the security camera in the corner. "The numbers don't add up. If the chief sees this, the chief won't see anything if you do your job," David interrupted, his voice cold and precise. He leaned in, his shadow looming over the tech. "You have a promising career ahead of you, Jason. I've seen your work. I've written your recommendations. It would be a shame if a procedural misunderstanding ended that before it started." Jason swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet lab. He looked at David, searching for a hint of the mentor he once respected, but found only a man with dark circles under his eyes and a desperate, ironclad will. "What do you want me to do?" "The digital backup," David said, tapping the desk. "It syncs at midnight. I need you to ensure the pharmacy reconciliation doesn't flag the discrepancy. You're the only one with the access codes tonight." "That's a felony, David," Jason stammered, his fake laugh surfacing as a high-pitched, nervous titter. "Letting a woman die because of a clerical error is the real crime," David countered. He reached out and gripped Jason's shoulder, his fingers digging into the fabric of the boy's lab coat. "Do this, and I'll make sure you're first in line for the residency opening in June. Refuse, and I'll make sure the board hears about the errors I found in your last 3 blood panels. It was a lie, a cruel fabrication, but it worked." Jason slumped, his head hanging low. "Okay, I'll fix the sync. Just leave me out of the rest of it." David patted his shoulder, a gesture that felt like a benediction to a condemned man. "Good lad. We're doing the right thing, Jason. Remember that." David turned to leave, his heart hammering against the stolen vial. He headed for the north stairwell, the one rarely used after the evening shift change. The concrete walls felt like they were slowly cinching inward, the air thick with the hum of the ventilation system that made his teeth ache. He reached the 3rd-floor landing when a shadow detached itself from the wall. "Dr. Miller? A bit late for a stroll, isn't it?" It was Miller, a different Miller, a security guard named Mark Wilson. He was a man who smelled of stale coffee and cheap tobacco, his weathered skin looking like cracked leather in the dim emergency lighting. He stood with his arms crossed, his thick, calloused thumb picking at a bleeding cuticle. "Just heading to my car, Mark," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. He reached for the heavy door handle, but Wilson stepped into his path. "Funny thing," Wilson said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The system flagged an unauthorized badge swipe at the pharmacy 10 minutes ago. Your badge, Doctor. And I don't see any paperwork for a late-night requisition. There was an emergency titration for Ward B." David lied, his hand tightening on the strap of his bag. "Check with Nurse Holloway." "I did. She said you were doing inventory." Wilson's eyes dropped to David's breast pocket, where the slight bulge of the vial was visible. "What's in the pocket, Doc? Let's take a look." "Step aside, Mark. I'm tired and I have a sick wife at home. I can't do that. Policy says—" Wilson reached out to grab David's arm, his grip like a vice. The physical contact snapped something inside David. The years of grief, the pressure of Sarah's illness, and the adrenaline of the theft exploded. David lunged forward, using his momentum to shove Wilson against the concrete wall. The guard groaned, his head hitting the masonry with a sickening thud. They scrambled on the narrow landing, the sound of heavy breathing and scuffing boots echoing up the stairwell. Wilson was stronger, but David was desperate. David's hand landed on a heavy medical textbook he'd been carrying in his side pocket, a thick volume on oncology. He swung it with everything he had, the corner of the book catching Wilson across the forearm. There was a sharp crack, the sound of a dry branch breaking, and Wilson let out a strangled cry, his grip loosening. David didn't stay to check the damage. He shoved past the staggering guard and sprinted down the remaining flights of stairs, his lungs burning. He burst through the exit door into the parking garage, the cool night air hitting his face like a splash of water. He ran toward his sedan, fumbling for his keys. The garage was a cathedral of gray concrete and long shadows. The rhythmic splat of a leaky pipe mimicking the sound of approaching footsteps. He reached his car, his hand trembling as he unlocked the door. He threw his bag into the passenger seat and was about to slide behind the wheel when he saw a familiar figure sitting in a dark SUV parked 3 stalls away. It was Robert Hayes, the metronome. Hayes sat perfectly rigid, the interior light of his vehicle casting a harsh glow on a stack of folders in his lap. He didn't look up, but David could see what he was doing. He was holding a red pen, meticulously circling lines on a medical chart. David's heart stopped. Those were Sarah's files. The original, unedited files that David thought he had buried under a mountain of digital noise. Hayes adjusted his glasses, his movements precise and mechanical. He reached out and straightened a pen on his dashboard, moving it exactly 1 inch to the right until it was perfectly parallel with the edge of the plastic. This was the man who fired people for a single wrinkle in their uniform. The man who saw every deviation as a vulnerability. If he was auditing Sarah's file now, in the middle of the night, it meant the scent of blood was in the air. David ducked behind his car door, his breath coming in shallow hitches. He watched Hayes through the glass, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The vial in his pocket felt like a ticking bomb. He had the cure, but the architect of his destruction was sitting 30 feet away, armed with a red pen and a devotion to the rules that bordered on the pathological. Suddenly, a loud, electronic chirp echoed through the garage. The overhead lights flickered, and a robotic voice began to broadcast over the PA system. Code Silver. Total building lockdown initiated. All personnel remain stationed. Repeat, Code Silver. The automated shutters at the garage entrance began to grind downward, heavy steel curtains sealing the exit. David looked at the closing gap, then at Hayes, who was now looking toward the garage elevators with a frown. David realized he was trapped. If he tried to drive out now, he'd be crushed by the shutters or intercepted by the security teams already swarming the lower levels. He had to get back inside. He had to find a way to neutralize the audit before Hayes saw the truth. Abandoning his car, David slipped back toward the service entrance, his mind racing. He was no longer just a doctor trying to save his wife. He was a fugitive in his own hospital. He reached the 4th floor via a service elevator, the metal walls vibrating with the low hum of the building's nervous system. He made his way to Hayes's office, the hallway smelling of expensive pipe tobacco. The cloying, sweet scent that always preceded the man. David pressed his ear to the mahogany door. Inside, the rhythmic whir-clack of a paper shredder cut through the silence. Whir-clack, whir-clack. David's brow furrowed. Why would Hayes be shredding documents during a lockdown? He peered through the thin gap in the doorframe. He couldn't see Hayes, but he saw the shadow of a man standing over a wastebasket. This wasn't an audit. It was a cleansing. A horrifying thought struck David. Hayes wasn't looking for David's mistakes. He was hiding his own. The clerical error that had denied Sarah her treatment, perhaps it wasn't an error at all. Perhaps it was a deliberate restructuring of funds that Hayes had authorized. And now that David was poking around the pharmacy logs, Hayes was panicking. David pulled back, his head spinning. The hospital was a house of mirrors. He turned and retreated toward his own office, needing a moment of sanctuary to think. But when he reached his door, he saw it was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was freezing, the AC stuck at a bone-chilling 60 degrees. His breath came out in a faint white mist. The desk had been ransacked. Drawers pulled out, papers scattered like fallen leaves. In the center of the floor lay the framed photo of Sarah. The glass was shattered, the jagged shards reflecting the flickering overhead light. It looked like a deliberate act of violence, a message. David knelt and picked up the photo, the cold glass biting into his palm. He felt a surge of protective rage. Someone was hunting him. Not just the hospital, not just the law, but someone who knew exactly where to twist the knife. Looking for this? David spun around. Standing in the doorway was the security guard, Mark Wilson, his arm now in a makeshift sling, flanked by 2 other officers. Behind them stood Jason Reed, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the floor. "You're a hard man to catch, Miller," Wilson growled, his hand resting on his holster. "But the waiting room is full of people who saw you assault an officer. There's nowhere left to run." The officers moved in, but David didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy metal IV pole from the corner and swung it in a wide arc, forcing the guards back. He lunged into the hallway, the waiting room erupting into chaos as he burst through the double doors. Families screamed, infants wailed, and the flickering news monitor on the wall cast a strobe-like light over the melee. David shoved through the crowd, using the sensory swamp of the waiting area as a shield. He saw the service elevator doors closing and dove between them just as Wilson's hand reached out to grab his collar. The elevator rose, and David leaned against the wall, gasping for air. He looked at Jason, who was standing in the corner of the small car, trembling. "Jason, you have to help me," David wheezed. "Hayes is destroying the evidence. We have to get into the mainframe. We have to wipe everything, the pharmacy logs, the patient files, everything. It's the only way we both get out of this." Jason didn't move. He didn't look up. He reached into his lab coat and pulled out a small, sleek device with a glowing blue light. "I'm sorry, David," Jason whispered, his voice devoid of its usual nervous titter. "I really am. You were a good mentor, but I'm not a lab tech." He turned the device around. It was a high-definition recording unit, linked directly to the hospital's internal affairs server. "My name is Special Agent Jason Reed," he said, his voice now flat and professional. "I've been undercover here for 6 months, investigating the restructuring of the pension funds. I wasn't looking for you, David. I was looking for Hayes. But you just kept giving me evidence. The coercion, the theft, the assault. It's all on the cloud now. There is no mainframe to wipe." The elevator doors opened. They were in the pathology lab. Waiting for them was Robert Hayes, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. Hayes looked at David with a cold, clinical detachment, his silver hair perfectly slicked back, not a single hair out of place. "Dr. Miller," Hayes said, his voice a smooth, terrifying calm, "you've caused quite a disruption. I believe it's time we discussed your resignation." David felt the world tilt. The betrayal was absolute. Jason, the boy he thought he was protecting, was the one who had tightened the noose. And Hayes, the man he thought was a fellow criminal, was standing there with the law at his back. "Sarah," David croaked, the name finally breaking past his lips. "She needs the medicine." "Mrs. Miller is being taken care of," Hayes said, straightening his tie 3 times. "By actual doctors. Take him." As the officers moved to cuff him, the hospital's fire alarm began to wail. A piercing, rhythmic shriek that vibrated through the floorboards. In the confusion of the alarm, David saw his opening. He used the weight of his own body to knock into the distracted officer, grabbed a chemical fire extinguisher from the wall, and sprayed a blinding cloud of white powder into the room. Under the cover of the chemical fog, David bolted. He didn't go for the exit. He went for the oncology ward. He found Sarah's room, the scent of jasmine and antiseptic filling his nostrils. She was sitting up in bed, her skin looking like old paper, her eyes wide as she counted the stairs she heard in the distance. 1, 2, 3. "Sarah, we have to go," David said, his voice frantic. He grabbed her wheelchair, helping her into it with a strength born of pure terror. "David? What's happening?" "The alarms." "It's okay. I have the cure. I have everything. We just have to get to the cabin." He navigated the chaos of the emergency evacuation, blending in with the dozens of other staff members wheeling patients toward the exits. The police were focused on the pharmacy and the labs. They didn't expect a doctor to be kidnapping his own wife in broad daylight. He reached his car. The shutters had been raised for the evacuation, and sped out of the garage, the tires screaming against the concrete. They drove for hours, leaving the sterile white lights of the city for the jagged, dark tree line of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The wind whistled through the pines, a constant, mournful sound that drowned out the radio. David kept checking the rearview mirror, his eyes searching for the flash of red and blue lights. They reached the cabin as the sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. David carried Sarah inside, laying her on the bed in the small, lonely room. "I'm going to give you the medicine now, Sarah," he said, his hands shaking as he pulled a syringe from his bag. He didn't use the stolen vial, not yet. He filled the syringe with a harmless saline solution. He needed her compliant, needed her to believe he was the hero before he administered the real, volatile drug. This is it. This is the miracle. He injected the saline, and for a moment, the silence in the cabin was absolute. Sarah lay back, her eyes closing. An hour passed. The wood stove crackled, the smell of old smoke filling the room. To David's delusional eyes, Sarah looked better. Her cheeks seemed to have a hint of color. Her breathing seemed deeper. He sat by the bed, the grocery list in his hand, feeling a surge of triumph. He had done it. He had beaten the system, the auditors, and the law. "I feel stronger, David," Sarah whispered, sitting up. She reached for a glass of water on the nightstand and took a long drink. The water tastes so cold, so clear. "It's working," David said, a tear tracking through the grime on his face. "I told you I'd save you." "You did," she said, her voice sounding strangely hollow. "You saved me from having to wonder what you were capable of." She stood up, moving with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible for a woman in her condition. She walked to the window and looked out at the darkening woods. "David," she said, her back to him, "why are there lights in the driveway?" David lunged for the window. A single police cruiser was winding its way up the dirt road, its headlights cutting through the mist. He ran for the door, his mind screaming escape. But when he reached the porch, he stopped dead. His car was slumped on its rims. All four tires had been slashed, the rubber gaping like open wounds. And standing on the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, was Deputy Sheriff Mark Wilson. He wasn't in a hospital uniform now. He was in brown khakis, a star pinned to his chest. He looked at David, then at the cabin. "The hospital isn't the only place with security cameras, Miller," Wilson said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He began to hum a tune, a low, haunting funeral dirge. "Nearer, my God, to thee." David roared and lunged at the deputy, his hands clawing for the man's throat. They hit the muddy ground together, rolling in the dirt and the rotting leaves. David fought with the strength of a cornered animal, but Wilson was a wall of muscle and stoicism. He took David's blows without a sound, his only reaction the constant, low humming of the dirge. Finally, Wilson pivoted, pinning David's face into the cold mud. He pulled David's arms behind his back, the metal handcuffs clicking shut with a finality that sounded like a cell door. "It's over, Doc," Wilson said, breathing hard. David looked up, his face smeared with filth. Sarah was standing on the porch, holding her phone. Her face was no longer pale. It was set in a mask of cold, hard resolve. "I recorded it all, David," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "The confession in the car, the injection. I knew about the pharmacy error 3 days ago. Dr. Hayes called me. He told me what you were doing." "Sarah, no. I did it for you." "You did it for yourself," she screamed, her voice breaking. "You didn't want to lose another patient. You didn't even care if I wanted the treatment. I haven't been taking the pills you gave me, David. I've been flushing them down the drain for weeks. I stayed because I had to make sure you couldn't do this to anyone else. I had to be the witness." She looked down at him, her eyes full of a pity that was worse than hatred. "You aren't a healer anymore. You're just a thief who can't let go of the dead." The rain began to fall then, a cold, needle-like drizzle that soaked into David's clothes. He lay in the mud, the weight of the handcuffs pressing into his wrists, watching the woman he loved turn her back on him and walk into the cabin. He was completely alone. The silence of the mountains was broken by the arrival of more sirens. As the backup officers swarmed the clearing, the deputy sheriff suddenly stiffened. He let out a wet, gasping sound and slumped over David, his hands clawing at his own throat. "Wilson?" David grunted, struggling under the man's weight. The deputy's face was turning a terrifying shade of purple. His eyes rolled back, and his breathing became a frantic, high-pitched whistle. David saw a small red welt on the back of the officer's neck. A bee sting. "Anaphylaxis," David whispered. The man was dying. "Get the bag," Wilson wheezed, his fingers fumbling for the keys to the handcuffs, subverted. David felt a surge of professional instinct. This was his chance. If he saved the officer, maybe there was a path to redemption. Maybe the court would see he was still a doctor. "Unlock me," David shouted. "I can perform a tracheotomy. I have the kit in my bag." Wilson, his vision fading, fumbled with the key. The cuffs fell away. David scrambled to his bag, his fingers moving with surgical precision. He found a pocket knife and a hollow-point pen. This was the smartest move, a life-saving intervention in the field. He'd done it a dozen times in the ER. He knew the anatomy, knew the risks. He would save the man who caught him, and in doing so, save his own soul. "Hold him down," David commanded the other officers who had just arrived. They hesitated. Then, seeing the deputy's purple face, they obeyed. David felt a moment of intense clarity. He was the hero again. He made the incision, his hand steady despite the rain. He inserted the hollow tube of the pen into the windpipe. Wilson's chest gave a great, heaving lurch, and the whistling sound was replaced by the sweet, rhythmic hiss of air entering the lungs. David sat back on his heels, wiping the blood from his hands onto his scrubs. He felt a wave of relief. He had succeeded. He looked at the other officers, expecting to see gratitude, perhaps even respect. "He's breathing," David said, his voice confident. "He's going to be fine." The officers didn't smile. They didn't nod. One of them stepped forward and kicked David's medical bag away, while the other slammed David back down into the mud, reapplying the handcuffs with such force that David's thumb went numb. "You think that changes anything?" The officer spat. "You just assaulted a federal witness and kidnapped a terminal patient. You saving him doesn't make you a doctor. It just makes you a liability with a knife." The victory was a hollow shell. He hadn't bought his freedom. He had only ensured he'd be alive to face the full weight of his crimes. He watched as they loaded Wilson into an ambulance, the man he saved not even looking at him. But the true collapse was yet to come. Subverted. Jason Reed stepped out of the second police cruiser, his suit looking sharp even in the mountain mist. He walked over to David, his face devoid of the chameleon warmth he'd used in the lab. "David," Jason said, his voice quiet. "There's something you need to know about the immunotherapy you stole." "It's the best in the world," David snapped. "It would have saved her if she'd just taken it." Jason shook his head. "We ran the labs on the vial we recovered from your car, the one you stole. It wasn't experimental immunotherapy, David. It was a high-concentration batch of aggressive cellular toxins meant for late-stage research, not human trials. The clerical error you found, it wasn't about insurance. It was a quarantine flag. The batch was contaminated." David's heart stopped. "No, I checked the lot numbers." "You checked the logs you altered," Jason said. "The administration of even a single dose." "David, Sarah didn't flush all of it. We found 2 empty syringes in the cabin. She took the first 2 doses because she wanted to believe you. She wanted to give you a chance." The truth hit David like a physical blow to the stomach. The recovery he thought he saw in the cabin, the color in her cheeks, the strength in her voice, it wasn't healing. It was the rally before the end. The body's final, frantic surge before the internal organs began to shut down. The toxins caused irreversible hepatic failure. Jason continued, his voice flat. "If you had just followed the protocols, if you had just talked to the board." Sarah had a treatable form of the disorder. She had years left. But the drug you forced on her? It did more damage in 6 hours than the cancer did in 6 months. She's being taken to the ICU now. But the doctors, they say it's too late for a transplant. David looked toward the ambulance where Sarah was being loaded. The world felt like it was dissolving into a blur of gray rain and flashing lights. He had tried to play God, and in his arrogance, he had become the very death sentence he was trying to outrun. His smart play, the theft, the lies, the secret treatment, hadn't just failed. It had murdered the only person he cared about. Months later, David Miller stood in a Virginia courtroom. The dark wood paneling and the mechanical clack of the wall clock felt like the walls of a tomb. He looked small in his orange jumpsuit, the dark circles under his eyes now looking like permanent ink. He refused a lawyer. He refused a defense. When the judge asked for his plea regarding the death of the patient whose records he had swapped and the charges of medical malpractice and kidnapping, David only looked at the back of the room. Sarah wasn't there. She was in a garden in a hospice center, her sister holding her hand as she watched the sun hit the silk flowers. "Guilty," David said, his voice a hollow echo. "I am guilty of everything." He delivered a statement, not of excuse, but of confession. He spoke of the ghost list in his wallet, of the daughter he couldn't save, and the wife he had destroyed in the name of his own guilt. He acknowledged his hubris, his belief that he was above the laws of man and nature. The judge sentenced him to life, without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away, David felt a strange, cold peace. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel the need to check his watch. He didn't feel the need to rewrite the list. In his cell, he sat on the narrow cot, staring at the only thing they allowed him to keep, a small, unbroken photo of Sarah from before the illness. The room was silent, devoid of the hospital's hum or the mountain's whistle. He was no longer a doctor, no longer a savior, no longer a thief. He was just a man in a quiet room, finally relinquishing the need for control, finding his penance in the silence of the life he had earned.